If we continue, just one more term that I want you to understand and be aware of, and that is conceptual metaphor. Metaphors are not just a matter of language, right? So metaphors can exist at a level that's deeper than language, and this is something that's been explored, especially by George Lakoff. He's a cognitive linguist at Berkeley, and he suggests that that we actually think in metaphors, right? So a conceptual metaphor is a metaphorical way of thinking. So thinking about one thing in terms of another. And so the idea here is that very often the way in which we actually construct our ideas or our concepts, we do this by using metaphors, right? So Lakoff is talking about metaphors at a kind of deeper level. There's a kind of a metaphorical way of thinking that underlies and explains our language usage. And just to give you an example of this, to show you what he's talking about, this is in the reading on conceptual metaphor. There's a link to it on the syllabus for this day to go along with these slides. And Lakoff gives this as an example of a conceptual metaphor. Argument is war. So what does that mean? What this means is that we think about argument as a kind of war. So in other words, war is the source. We draw language and ideas from war, and we use that as when we talk about or even think about what an argument is, right? So and so in the case of a conceptual metaphor like this, it's because we conceptualize argument as a kind of war, then this conceptualization leads to a whole way of talking about argument, so that there's a whole series of things that we say, language that we use, that indicate that that's the way that we think about argument. And I'll just read a little bit to you from Lakoff's article. That again, there's a link to this on page 3 of his article. At the bottom of the page, the third page of the PDF, he gives this as an example of conceptual metaphor. He says argument is war, and then he gives a whole series of sentences in which have to do with arguments, but the language that's being used is the language of war and fighting and combat. So, for example, your claims are indefensible. He attacked every weak point in my argument. His criticisms were right on target. I demolished his argument. I've never won an argument with him. You disagree? Okay, shoot. If you use that strategy, he'll wipe you out. He shot down all my arguments. So these are all expressions. There's a whole then series of expressions here where we're using the language of war in order to talk about arguing. And so this is an example of a conceptual metaphor. And so yet another kind of key idea, something that we want to notice and think about, and this is something that you may find conceptual metaphors yourself. It's kind of a fun and interesting thing to think about when you're looking at these Greek and Latin elements and how they're used. Sometimes you may recognize that, hey, it looks like this indicates that this is the way in which we think about something. The metaphors that are being used in order to express some abstract idea like argument. And in fact, I gave you a kind of conceptual metaphor before, and I've talked about it already. Here are actually a couple more examples of them. First, it seems that we think about understanding as grabbing and holding something. At least this is one way of conceptualizing understanding. We think about it as kind of grabbing, getting hold of, and keeping something. And you could probably come up with expressions that are kind of evidence for this, that this is a way that we think about understanding. So if I say, do you get it? Right? I'm using get, which is kind of holding and keeping something. Can you grasp what I'm saying? Right. So grasping, again, grasp can mean to understand. And so again, it's an example of this underlying conceptual metaphor. Now, of course, that may not be the only conceptual metaphor that we use to try to explain understanding. Some things are very complicated, and we use a variety of different conceptual metaphors to try to get at them, to try to express them, because they are especially difficult. But this is one. Or another one, happiness is warmth and light. right? Don't we think about, if you think about happiness, one way of kind of conceptualizing it would be a nice warm sunny day in Southern California when you can go out and for a nice walk, right? So of course, happiness as a concept is difficult, right? It's something that, right? How do you define happiness and communicate it? But if you look for some kind of source that's more physical and easier to visualize, that somehow you see as a good expression of this conception of happiness, then you can use a kind of metaphor in order to express it. And of course, then there may be lots of different ways of, maybe different kinds of metaphors, different conceptual metaphors that we could use, because again, happiness could be a very complex thing that lots of people disagree on, have different ideas of. But in any case, we could see these as being conceptual metaphors. I gave the example. The last thing I have on the outline is the quote from the Stevie Wonder song, "You are the sunshine of my life." So this, to me, this is an example. Of course, this is kind of poetic and from a song, but it's, when he's saying "you are the sunshine of my life," it seems to me that he's saying you make me happy. Right? It's a metaphorical way of expressing the happiness that this person brings. So that's kind of a short introduction to metaphor, and it's something then that I want you to try to really make sure you understand, and then be aware of in your everyday language, and be aware of as you study the Greek and Latin roots and examples of them. And I'll try to bring up examples, but I hope that whenever you find something that might be an example of a metaphor or a conceptual metaphor or some kind of metaphorical development in the meaning of words, especially the Greek and Latin based words, bring it up. Point it out. I would love to hear and collect that kind of information from you. Now I'm going to have just a couple examples, or a couple of questions on this lecture, just to make sure that you've gotten some basic comprehension of things. But that's it for metaphor, and that's it for this week. So I will see you. I'll hope to hear from you all, and I will see you with the next lecture slides. Bye-bye.